So my great pleasure to introduce our own Professor David Suarez. I don't think I have to introduce him any more than just showing.
Beard and no beard, I'm the same person.
Yeah, so this is the last for the Petrosian Research Grant Series, the finale for the semester. And I know David has lived and breathed the air from the national parks, and he knows how to create public values out of it. And I'm looking forward to hear what David has to say.
Great. Thanks, everybody, and thank you, Jan, for the introduction. Let me start just by clarifying a few things. First of all, I obviously want to thank the Bedrosian Center for funding this project. It is ongoing. There's going to be more coming out of this, so this is one piece out of a bigger study. I hope to do a few more interviews and expand it, but there's enough, obviously, here for a presentation. The other heads up, if you want to call it that, I want to give you is this is a qualitative study and a qualitative presentation. So you're not going to see regressions, p-values, descriptive statistics, and moreover, I'm going to ask you to do some reading. So there are some slides where I draw on narrative evidence from the interviews I have done. So it's a little different than the typical format here, but I've tried to develop the slides and present things in a way that is hopefully engaging and will get a lot of discussion going. And feel free to interrupt or raise questions anywhere along as we go. The major project itself is interested in looking at whether or not public-private partnerships, specifically public nonprofit partnerships, can create public value in national parks. So there are several different contributions I'd like to make. The first is just a broader interest in national parks. There is a stunningly small amount of literature on national parks. I've talked to some who have said, well, the reason for that is national parks are boring. They're insular, they're bureaucratic, and they don't really listen to anybody, and so there's not much to study there. They're on their own, and so they don't interact or engage with anyone else. Part of what I hope to accomplish is to demonstrate that is an old view and that's no longer the case. And national parks are facing many of the same challenges that other public agencies are facing. And so they're turning to collaboration as a way to get work done. And the question is, what is this going to do? Is it effective? What are the upsides? What are the downsides? So one piece is the focus on national parks. Another piece is this focus on public value. And for me, public value is a concept that allows us to talk about partnerships in a way that moves beyond the contract. I think there's plenty of good research on transaction costs, on collaborative relationships, but they tend to be focused on the partnership itself. What I'm looking at is a long-term change over a 20-year period with the same two agencies working together. So the idea there is to look at value that comes from the long term, value that comes from stewardship in a relationship that is enduring and not simply bound by the contract. So that's not to try to minimize what contractual research does, but this is an attempt to look somewhere else and say, when you study and analyze a partnership over time, what do you see that you might not otherwise see with contracts? The third piece I'm trying to do is look at the costs and the benefits. For the most part, the literature on contracting has been, I would say, celebratory. That's what McGuire and others have said, and I think it's fairly accurate that for political reasons, contracting became common during the 80s and 90s. So it was about making government smaller. It was about having less government involvement, and so you heard about the hollowing out of the public sector. So if nothing else, for political reasons, you had quite a large amount of contracting. There was also a lot of discussion about transaction costs and the reduced costs to the public agencies as a result of contracting. So it wasn't simply a political argument. There were plenty of good economic arguments, and if you could reduce the monitoring costs and do the dynamics of the make or buy decision, well, you contract out. But that's not all there is to the story, in my opinion. There's a lot more to what potentially can be gained. So that's what I'm looking at here. And with public value, For me, there's some debate on this terminology, but for me it's simply a broader conceptualization of return on your investment. If it's in the private sector, it's pretty straightforward. Even in the public sector, if you're using a transaction cost framework and you can demonstrate that there are cost savings to the relationship, that is a fairly straightforward way of looking at public value that I think equates very directly to the private sector. But there are other aspects to it too. If you improve the relationship with citizens, I'm thinking here of Terry's work on collaborative public management, citizen-centered collaborative public management, improving the relationships with citizens without any net cost, that could be considered public value. Improving the effectiveness of an agency, which isn't necessarily efficiency, right? But they're similar, but that is also a way of thinking about public value. And then finally, number 4 relates to all the prior 3, which is just the legitimacy of public agencies. If we have more trust in our government, if we believe in what government is doing and what the public agencies are doing, that is creating public value. That's the way that I approach this. So before we go into this, contracting, most of us know, Craig Thomas was here the other day and spoke about some of this. I'm not interested in what explains collaboration. That's not what I'm trying to do here, but I at least want to do a quick review of what we know. There are plenty of reasons that organizations collaborate. For legitimacy, for resources, for politics, there are plenty of good reasons for doing so. And the frameworks for analyzing it, transaction costs, resource dependence, institutional theory, organizational learning, there are almost as many theories to explain collaboration as there are types of collaboration. That's not what I'm trying to do here, but it does set a background for what we're looking at. From the other side, and what I think hasn't been explored sufficiently, is why not collaborate? What are the dangers involved in collaboration? And this is, again, where I think the public value framework is useful. If you look just at the collaboration as a dyad, as a one-to-one, you can say organizations choose not to collaborate if and when X, Y, and Z. So there are plenty of good reasons, but you don't often see the long-term costs, the long-term benefits. You focus on the contract itself and on the costs and benefits to the organizations involved. By looking at national parks, the approach I'm taking is this is something that's supposed to endure. This is what Ken Burns and others have called America's best idea. So the notion there is you should probably take care of these public agencies. You should care about these public agencies. And if the collaboration doesn't work, what are the long-term damages and costs to this? So it's not simply an issue of, well, we lost some money, there was some value lost. Here, this is America's national heritage, because I'm focusing on the United States. So the question is, what can be lost in that relationship? So that sets the background. Some of you may have seen this before. It's an old slide of mine, but I think it just captures a difference in the way that we're looking at relationships. When you speak of hollow government, this is something I coded directly from the Social Science Citation Index. It's pretty easy to do. I just coded outsource, contract, privatize, devolve, and decentralize over time with all combinations of that word, and you see that it tapers off as a topic. But during the 80s and 90s, it was huge. What has come up, relatively speaking, is collaboration, partnering, networking, and all the things that go along with it. But what I haven't seen is a lot of discussion of performance and what collaborations achieve. So there's a lot of normative discussion of collaboration. There's some discussion of the economic benefits of collaboration, but not much more than that. So you know, again, not to beat a dead horse, but that's what I'm trying to do in this study, is qualitatively get a sense of the long-term costs and benefits of these types of relationships. Questions so far? Maybe this will go faster than I thought. So the argument, sorry for a lot of words here, but part of what I'm trying to do is bring the idea of public value into discussions of performance. What do we get from these relationships? So I want to expand beyond the immediate tie to say the overall benefit that we get in the long term. I think it's a much more useful way for talking about things than wicked social problems. I'm not a big fan of that language. I don't understand what that means. I'm not sure what social problems are not wicked, and I'm not sure either that we're getting to the point of solving these social problems. And that's a lot of what we hear about from the network discourse of why we have networks. The idea of networks is to help solve social problems. Well, I'm not convinced that that way of talking about it gets us very far. So I'm hoping that the public value framework gets us a little bit further along that line. Yeah?
So why is public value as a collective construct useful? I mean, I can understand why the individual pieces are useful, and they're founded in a lot of social science research, but from the slide and hearing you so far, I sort of feel like public value and wicked social problems are the same kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's hopefully what will become clear as we go along. But my gambit, or the point that I'm trying to make here, is we can actually look at specific measures that I hopefully will present to look at these things and say, is this public value or is it not? Whereas wicked social problems doesn't have much of a heuristic for saying what is or what is not. So we can call it a cost-benefit analysis that focuses on non-economic issues. Whatever we want to describe it, I think it provides a more useful and rigorous frame for looking at it. That's, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but perhaps as we go along. Yeah. And if not, tell me, because this is not a published paper. This is something I'm trying to work on. What I do argue is that substantial public value can be created through these partnerships. So one aspect of that is physical park improvements. And I have to be really clear here. We're not talking about the Department of Social Services providing a contract to a nonprofit to implement a program. This is a very different world where the nonprofit is in fact providing funding for the public agency to implement its work. So the tables are turned in some respects here, but the nonprofit that I'm going to be talking about, and presumably other nonprofits that work with national park agencies, can provide a great deal of resources. They can help with program implementation. They can help with project implementation. So they can do things that presumably the national park itself would not be able to do as easily. Second, they also help with the process, meaning they're able to engage new members, in particular diversity. They're able to engage people through civic engagement, so they're able to get people involved. They're able to get volunteers. They're able to do things that obviously public agencies like the National Park Service are trying to do, but these nonprofits perhaps have a comparative advantage in doing so. So those are the possible benefits that I see for my case that I think we can talk about for policy and practice implementation for the future of the National Park Service. Having said that, I want to be really clear as well that there are some very serious downsides to these partnerships that perhaps get at Tony's point of what are the downsides. If you want to talk about negative public value, I think there's a lot to be said there. So there are many aspects to partnerships with national parks that can reduce the value of the national park, presumably. One argument is that the public agency could have done this itself. I think we can reject that outright. There's just no way that that's possible. But then we start getting to more plausible arguments. One is, this is just another example of the hollow state, and that the public agency is getting less resources, the nonprofit is being given more resources, and eventually the public agency is going to have very little role and it's just going to be the nonprofit. So it's a replacement story. With state parks in California, there's a lot to be said there. And perhaps this is part of the argument, right? So keep that in mind. But for me, the bigger issues are the final one here. What are the trade-offs? What happens if a partnership goes wrong? What could happen? What happens with donors who want to give money for a specific project? So this is a classic philanthropic question of how much can the donors demand that the public agency do what they want. Finally, there's this notion of public managers as platonic guardians. I think this is some of what Tony has done in his work to talk about what public managers should do. One of the critiques of Mark Moore's discussion of public value is that these are people gone awry. These are public managers who have just taken control and decided to usurp the power of elected officials, doing their own thing, and not actually enacting the will of the people. So what danger is there of that when you look at public-private partnerships in national park settings? And I think there is some danger of that. So those are the costs, those are the benefits, and hopefully my case will clarify what we get from that. Yeah.
I don't understand the California state parks, they privatize?
The California state parks are quasi-privatizing in some places. They are asking nonprofits to take over the management of certain aspects of what they're doing, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently. Some state parks are going to be closed, and the danger there is there are a lot of costs to not running the national park. One of them is marijuana cultivation is spoken of quite a lot. So there are plenty of problems with not keeping a park even open with a skeleton staff. So they're asking nonprofits to come in, and that may be the first step. If you look at Central Park in New York, that is a public park run by a nonprofit almost entirely, and with a lot of concessions that are run by that same nonprofit. So that would be that storyline. Other questions on that? All right, so let me give you a quick, there's a lot of lead into this, but I do actually have to do a little bit of background on the National Park Service so that we're all on the same page of what the service is and what they do. The first, obviously created in 1916. The National Antiquities Act is worth mentioning there, and the reason I want to mention that is people who don't know much about the National Park Service think of Yellowstone, they think of Yosemite, they think of the environment. There is a lot to the National Park Service that is not environmentally related. Gettysburg, I mean, there are plenty of different aspects of the National Park Service that are about the national heritage. Capitol Mall, the Washington Monument, all of these things are run by the National Park Service. So there are plenty of designations: national parks, national recreation areas, historic sites, battlefields, seashores. There's plenty of different designations. So I wanted to present that to get on the same page of what is it we're talking about when we talk about national parks and the National Park Service and what they do. As far as the way they work collaboration, I think it would be fair to say that the National Park Service has done everything in its power to make sure that park partners are as weak as they can possibly be. And what I mean by that is there are cooperating associations. Cooperating associations have a monopoly to sell books and educational services within the park. It's a way to get earned income, which is supposed to go back to the public agency. But it leaves the nonprofit quite weak because their only job is to provide earned income through the sale of these books. They have a monopoly, but they have one major role. Then there are friends groups which are not as contractually regulated, and the role of the friends groups is to raise funding, resources for the national park, but without a clear contractual obligation, and they don't have much power within the park. In many instances, they don't even operate within the park. What you're going to see in my case is a nonprofit that has decided to combine these two roles, which is legal but extremely contested and has led to quite a lot of debate within the National Park Service whether this is the right way to go. And that's actually part of what I'm posing to you as part of this discussion is what do we get from this and what are the costs? Because the National Park Service has been very reluctant to embrace a model where there's a powerful nonprofit that sells things in a park to get earned income, yet simultaneously has a fundraising arm and a membership arm that turns it into an what I would call an actual nonprofit. Yeah.
Just a question on fact here and historical. So the concessionaires, though, I don't see them as just selling books, and they're not friends groups. And you mentioned Yosemite, it's just one example. They're a huge player in what happens on the ground. Where do they fit into this?
Yeah, well, where they fit into this is in my little note down here, but but other than that, no, I mean, it's a good question, so I'm being flippant. Yeah, I didn't totally forget them. The concessionaires are regulated by a very different set of standards in the National Park Service. So they exist, they're very real, and they're there, but they're guided by a very different sort of regulations. The cooperating association is a specific regulatory it's a specific regulation that enables a nonprofit to have monopoly power to sell these things. These concessionaires work in some of the same space, and there is some discussion about overlap. So there's a GAO study of cooperating associations and concessionaires and how much they overlap and how much they don't. But in general, there's one cooperating association in a national park. Not every single national park has one, and they work essentially for free in a space that the National Park Service has designated for them to do visitor services and to sell books about Yosemite. Now, the Yosemite, just to give you another, they did exactly what I'm about to talk about. They combined the Friends Group and they combined the Cooperating Association into one entity in the last 4 years to do this. And they operate with concessionaires, but the concessionaires do their own thing. Oftentimes it is leading, if you're in San Francisco and you take the boat to Alcatraz, the boat to Alcatraz is a concessionaire. The actual interpretation that's done on Alcatraz is done by the National Park Conservancy, the nonprofit partner. It's doing interpretation. That is more of the cooperating association role as expanded. Is that clearer?
A little bit.
It is a source of overlap, and believe me, the solicitors are not particularly comfortable with some of this. But that's part of the story here. Yeah.
Yeah. So this question has as much to do with the literature on collaboration as it does with your presentation. But how can somebody who sells books in a national park be considered a collaborative partner under any legitimate definition of something that goes beyond a contract?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just curious about that.
Generally speaking, I would absolutely agree with you and not call them that, but they're called cooperating associations. I think there is a difference between a contract and a collaboration in my book. There are some people who call a contract a collaboration. There are some who say collaboration is a step but not sufficient for collaboration. I tend to be in the camp that says collaboration actually requires something a bit more. Here, the notion that makes it a cooperative agreement is that this isn't income that's being earned by the nonprofit and being reinvested in the nonprofit. It's actually being given to the public agency for its own program. So it is, the better the cooperating association does, the better the national park does for its projects. So there is some incentive for both parties to do well, to work together, and to have a long-term relationship that leads to public value and public benefit for the park. So that
as far as I understand, I mean, in a relational contract setting where there's a formal and an informal component, you can certainly embed incentives.
absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think you have an opportunity there in general, and we can talk about this at some point too. But I just don't. I don't think the language of cooperation is actually capturing the kind of things that you're doing, but that is not your fault. That is
Correct.
the fault of this.
And believe me, again, I may not achieve this, but this side, when they adopt the Friends Group role along with the Cooperating Association, I think you will see a lot more of what collaboration actually is that moves well beyond.
One step further on this very issue.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, I was thinking when I said concessionaires versus Parks Foundation that sells the books.
Mm-hmm.
They both work in the park, they both sell something to the public, but one is for profit.
Yep.
To the extent that that matters in this definitional. The concessionaire wins a concession to make a profit on doing something in the park that's of value to someone.
Yeah.
Whereas the National Park Foundation is a nonprofit that turns over, which could look like its fee to the park, but it turns over whatever it earns to the park. It's not contractually obliged over so much for
Right.
being there. So
Right.
there's a nonprofit agreement contract, and then there is a for-profit contract, and they're different. I don't know if that's the difference.
Yeah, well, and the National Parks Foundation is also a congressionally chartered nonprofit whose role is to help build love and respect and stewardship for national parks. So their mission is intimately tied. No, we do not ask that, although certainly we would like it. Yeah, Mark.
I think what's also floating around here is the history of the national parks as transcendent values. Whether they're cooperating associations, whether they're friends groups, and so forth, those people are expected to love the national parks. The guys who run the ferries,
Yeah.
even the guys who run the tours, you don't have to love the national parks,
Right.
in some sense.
No, I think that's right.
And so it's a very interesting thing. There's floating around in the background here, and it's probably not true for all such situations, is a transcendent value that, people make it part of America, they whatever. Certainly, Roosevelt, God knows what else. And that is, if you don't have that, you really can't be a authentic collaborator, I suspect.
And let me push that even further just to clarify the stakes, in my view, of what this is. The national parks partnering with nonprofits is problematic for precisely that reason. The national park employees, the national park services view themselves as the arbiter of our national lands and our national heritage. So anytime there is a foreign entity operating anywhere near their soil, they are quite uncomfortable. And so that's the tension I'm trying to focus on here of what is the value, if anything, that's created through these relationships when you think about the national parks, when you think about these transcendent values of what a national park is.
Right.
Yeah. Terry?
Well, I guess, I don't know whether this is the right time to raise this, but as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about how this presentation was entitled creating public value, it seems to me that the more fundamental problem, when you consider why the parks were created, transcendent value, that the problem really is not creating public value, but preserving public value.
Right.
And that's the problem I've observed over time with the parks. And my one dip into the parks had to do with the way the general plan was developed for Yosemite back in the late 70s.
Right.
And at that point, the public value of the park was being destroyed. There was air pollution that hung over Yosemite. Crime was increasing and all of those kinds of things. So the Congress, ordered a general plan development. Somebody, and I've never been able to discover who this is, had the wisdom to not do that simply as an exercise in expertise, planning expertise. They did a very, very extensive civic engagement process that involved people all over the country in a very lengthy and, in terms of dollar cost, very expensive process of developing a general plan. And part of that sort of preserved public value by staving off some of these excessive pressures for concession activity. So now it's been hard to implement that plan and maintain it over time, and I really haven't followed it that well. But isn't that really the more fun? We create these parks presumably for some public value. People have access to natural environments, places to hike, places to enjoy a natural environment, and all those kinds of things. And then the problem is preserving that public value.
I'm smiling a little bit because there are two ways to look at it. If I were presenting this simply to what I'd call the hardcore national park believers, preserving the national parks would mean not allowing any people into it, essentially allowing nature to exist. Yeah, that still exists. So there are some who will debate what I'm calling public value, but the accessibility of the park, building new stakeholders in the park, I view as not simply preserving, but actually creating value so that more can appreciate what it is. But so that I don't mean to disagree. It's more of a debate as to perhaps a national park partner doing a good job would essentially entail allowing the national park to close its doors to anyone else. But for the National Park Service to sustain itself, at least according to some of the interviews I've done, there's a growing recognition that they're not going to get federal support forever without having a constituency that understands the benefits of the parks. And so they do want to have people in there. They do want to make it accessible to people. They do want to market themselves effectively. They want the public to recognize what these national parks are and why they're there. So preserving that value, yes, but I don't think I'm willing to concede yet that it's not about creating public value. I think some of these park partners are actually trying to do things that make the park better, in quotes.
When the Yosemite plan was developed, there was a point of view that was sort of the Sierra Club point of view that even went to the point of saying no hooved animals in the park, meaning no pack animals, which was a bit ridiculous since you had deer in the park that had hooves, as I recall.
Yep.
And at that point, they didn't talk about public value as much as they talked about natural value. And so natural value was always in some kind of tension with public access, which would be a way of creating or making use of public value. Yeah. Potential public value as natural value.
And maybe the way to move us from that debate is to do the reminder that a lot of what the national parks do are not simply environmental, right? So if we're talking about Gettysburg and we want people to learn more about their history, we want people to go visit Gettysburg and we want it to be accessible to people. So you could create that viewpoint as public value. All right, so this, where I'm not going to make you read these, this is simply for those who might believe that the National Park Service is not moving in the direction of partnerships. So I wanted to include this to just clarify this isn't me as the scholar imposing some view that the National Park Service cares all of a sudden about partnering. They have moved very clearly in the direction of recognizing partners, for better or for worse. They have moved in this direction. They are talking about partnerships. They are hiring superintendents of national parks who can work outside the boundaries of the park, who can bring in stakeholders. So they're thinking about partnerships, they're thinking about ways that they can increase their role in the communities where they are embedded. So this isn't just navel gazing, me going in and studying one park. This is a National Park Service trying to move in a very concrete direction towards collaborative relationships with the community and how to make it happen. So I view this as very current, very real, and very much a dilemma within the Park Service about how to do this and what the risks are. So now we're going to move directly to the study itself, which I apologize it's taken so long to lead up to this. But the Golden Gate National Recreation Area is part of the San Francisco Bay Area. It is 80,000 acres, but not contiguous. So I want to make that clear. The Cooperating Association was created in 1981. So it's been operating there for quite a long time as a partner of the national park. So this isn't a contract where every 5 years they take bids for a new nonprofit to come in. Technically that is what happens, but it's pro forma because this organization has developed its ties, it is effective, it has built stakeholders, it is considered an organization that has done quite a lot, so it is part of the very fabric of the organization. This national park has several elements. Some of them are historic, some of them are environmental, and some of them are recreational. So it's considered the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The correlate of that is the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. So it's the exact same thing. It was created in 1972 with Gateway National Recreation Area in New York. Right? So it was the National Park Service effort to create urban national parks, or national parks in an urban area. So they are one of the new developments in national parks and the National Park Service. What I did to gather this data is, before I started, I spent a good year reading about the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, reading about the National Park Service, and getting as much information and data as I could. The GGNRA, its acronym as I'll call it, also has an archive, and I have spent considerable time at the archives. Then I went in and I interviewed about 55 different people, not just of the national park and not just of the Conservancy, but of the stakeholders. I interviewed several other park superintendents. I interviewed other cooperating association executive directors, and then I interviewed quite a number of the local partners that are stakeholders in the nonprofit. So it's a single case study, but it's an embedded design because I interviewed leaders of other organizations and their relationship with the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and how those affected the relationship with the park itself as well. So, and the goal here is not replicability. This is a unique case. I know it's a unique case. So in Michael Barzelay's term of extrapolation, the goal is to say, what can we learn from this case and think about it for other cases. Not to say that every single park can do what the Golden Gate National Recreation Area has done. I don't think they can. I think it's absolutely 100% guarantee not possible. But by looking at such an extreme case, we can look at the benefits, we can look at the costs, and we can question those and have a discussion about the practical implications and the policy implications as well. I apologize, this is about as good as you can get as a slide, but I want to at least give you a visual of what this is. The green area here is Point Reyes National Seashore. That's another national park. Everything in the lighter 2 shades of green are considered the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. But the really light green is the authorized boundary, but it's not the actual current Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So this area here is owned by the Public Utilities Commission. The GGNRA just finally got this little land here. So it's not contiguous, but it's all of these pieces. Alcatraz is considered part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The Marin Headlands are considered part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The Flagler Estate down here by Stanford is considered part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, but it's not contiguous, yet part of a national park. All right, so that'll give you a sense of the context. There's one more slide here that tips it over on its side to give you a different view. All of the green areas are public lands. They're not private, they're public. But not all of those are run by the same agency. Not all of those are run by the National Park Service. But they're all public lands. So that's pretty much what I'm looking at, with the exception of here, the point, although I did interview the superintendent of the Point Reyes National Seashore. So, getting to what I actually found, In my mind, there's no question from the interviews what these park partners can do when they have a very long-term collaborative relationship with the public agency. They're able to get members, they're able to fundraise, and they're able to do this in a way that recurs. It happens every year. The membership is a fee. The membership fee often gets reinvested in the work of the nonprofit and in the public agency to do a lot of the things that these public agencies want to achieve. Running the Golden Gate National Recreation Area costs about $18 million a year, and they're not using that $18 million simply to pay the salaries of their employees. They're trying to do a lot of different things. They're trying to improve the place, mainly for visitor accessibility, but this isn't an example of a national park where the goal is to have as many hands off as you possibly can, right? It's part of the fabric of an urban area. So they're able to fundraise, they're able to market. And marketing is huge, particularly in this instance because the national park is not contiguous. So people may be in one place and not recognize that it's a national park when it is. So the marketing that's being done is useful in the sense that it brings new people and recognition to what it does. And then finally, the national park partner does a lot of the actual implementation of some of these projects. So the capital projects, what I'm calling capital projects, capital campaign not in the fundraising side, but in the actual implementation. Some of the nonprofit partners do the building. They get the contracts, they do the building, they work with the National Park Service, but they have a lot of benefits in terms of flexibility that a public agency itself would not have. Just to clarify, that's a major point of contention with the solicitors in terms of what can be done and what cannot. Yeah.
So if I own a house that's in your green region, am I a national park partner?
No.
Why not?
If you own a house, you're a private citizen. And you're not actually part of the national park.
Right, according to your map, I am. So
there are some in-holdings. For example, this is an on-hold. This is an in-holding right there. That's private. This area right there is an in-holding. This area right here is an in-holding. Those are private lands.
So it's just difficult for me to figure out exactly, because when you go across the Golden Gate Bridge, I mean, there are plenty of houses there that look like they're in your green region. So.
Yep, and they are close. That would be this area right here, the Marine Headlands. Okay. And there are a lot that abut, and there are pieces there. I mean, what I tried to do is I tried to interview every single nonprofit organization that was operating within the authorized boundary of the national park. I also interviewed a nonprofit that owns some of this land here that's an in-holding to talk to them about their relationship with the Golden Gate National, because they're surrounded by it but aren't in fact guided by it. So I tried to be sensitive to that.
I mean, this is the source of the, like, in terms of the theoretical problem here. I think, you know, just take something I know, the relational contracting kind of framework, right? So there is a formal arrangement, right? If you own this property, you're developing it, or you're on a leasehold from the National Park Service or whatever it is, right? There's a formal component of that, but a big component of it is this relational aspect. So what keeps coming into my mind is analytically who's in and who's out the whole time you've been talking. And so anybody with a formal relationship should be in. Is that right?
There are different ways to look at that. I looked at the nonprofit partners, but talking to a lot of the employees, they determine what's considered a collaboration by the type of contract they establish with these different agencies. They sometimes view concessionaires as collaborators. They usually do not. They usually view lessees as people who are renting their land and not collaborators. So,
and you're saying it now. The thing that's really interesting here, and it's something that has to be said in this literature, I think. And I'm not a real expert on this literature, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But an understanding of collaboration right, in what you just said is coming from the people who are, it's coming from the national park, essentially.
Yeah.
We're defining what collaboration is. Whereas I think as analysts, we probably don't want to define collaborations that way. And so in some sense, that's what's kind of interesting about the way that you've selected these things, because you're asking people who might be park collaborators whether the park likes it or not, or wants to talk about it.
And National Park Service employees and superintendents and others. And keep in mind, just to clarify, for the purposes of this talk, we're talking about one organization. So I interviewed a whole lot of stakeholders, some of whom are not park partners. So it's not like I interviewed local neighborhood groups that abut the national park to talk to them about their relationship with the national park. So I tried to have a rather agnostic view on what a partner is. The real partner in this story is the official nonprofit partner that exists in almost every single National Park Service unit has an official cooperating association that is designated as the monopoly cooperating association. Then there's a friends group that oftentimes goes along with that, either as a separate entity or as a combined entity. So all of the interviews I did were to gain purchase on that tie, that relationship, and that sort of interaction, which I think even the most skeptical people, truly, would consider that a collaboration because of what they do. Yeah.
If I can follow up on this, what Tony says, I'm thinking about the product of your research professionally, academically. If you would help us, you would help Tony, I think, in his question, and the rest of us. If you had a spectrum of pure private, pure public, and then along that you said, well, collaboration takes place here in certain ways and in certain dimensions, and you actually could specify that in a way that all those different relationships could be fit in. That doesn't mean the Park Service defined them that way, but analytically you could say the Park Service calls this a lease, but on our spectrum it fits here. You know, Tony mentioned like first, I'm an in-holder, but I am. But you know, what is the Forest Service now calls me a partner. They used to just call me an in-holder. That's because they want something from me. But they do. But they're changing their definitions as our roles evolve. And so you need some kind of a metric or a spectrum, I would call it, not categories, but a spectrum, to help those of us who aren't familiar with all this to know how that matches up analytically, just to start out your discussion for us.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I didn't include it here, but one of the things I asked everyone is, what is a park partner, and are you a park partner? So these aren't things that I just didn't think about, but I was so focused on this one tie for this case that for me is so unambiguously on any dimension of any partnership that's ever existed between a public agency and a nonprofit. This is a partnership. It's extensive, intensive. It's a partnership, even if we want to be skeptical. But I mean, the point's well taken. I'm just trying to say it's hard to get full purchase. But another graph at some point that says this is a spectrum, this is where a concessionaire fits, this is where an in-holder fits, that would be a nice contribution. Yeah.
But people live in the national park. So what is their housing then under? Is that under? Who owns that?
Usually, I mean, I have a friend who lived in Point Reyes, and usually there are different stipulations, but it's usually the case, from my understanding, that upon death, that gets turned over to the national park. So you can't live there forever and ever and ever, but until then, you essentially live on that land. I mean, if you lived there before it became a national park, unless they take it over by eminent domain, you're there.
Presidio. Like, I just was at the Presidio last Friday because I wanted to go to the Walt Disney Family Museum, which is in a former barracks building. And then when I was looking up how do you get there, and it's complicated to do it on transit, but there's stuff about the shuttles are only for people who live and work there during certain times of the day. So that's how I knew that people definitely live, and this was federal property before it became a national park because it was a military installation, and that's why I was just curious about how that housing.
Yeah, I mean, we could go as in depth as you guys wanted into this. The Presidio is a government corporation. It's a separate entity that was chartered by, I mean, it's got a 7-member board that reports directly to Congress and the President of the United States. Their job is to make the Presidio of San Francisco financially self-sufficient. But it is a part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. You can view it as an inholding at some level, but it is national park land, and they rent out that land to different people. Those are considered tenants. They are generally not considered partners. The Presidio Trust, in my interviews with them, call them tenants. They're not calling them partners. They can become partners, along with what we've been discussing, if they start doing other things, as some of these agencies have done. Maybe the Walt Disney Museum, they are trying to call them a partner, but they're leasing that land to them for a given finite period of time, and that defines their relationship. Yeah.
I think I understand the concerns of my colleagues about collaboration, but I think what you need to do is, as a result of we haven't gotten to your punchlines, all right? But no, when you do a case study like this, the punchlines then justify being so restricted.
Yeah.
Because everybody else who's doing the studies doesn't see much.
Yeah.
And then the theoretical questions about what's a collaboration and so forth are much less important, because what you're trying to do is find out, here's an example, what does it do, how does it work?
Correct.
And so you have punchlines.
Yeah.
Then you could write another article which does all that other stuff.
Yeah.
And the people who are worried about, the generic notions of collaborations, whatever, they're a very, I should say, what's at stake for them is some theoretical argument, let us say.
Yeah.
And they don't know anything about any cases in general, because that's not what they do.
Right.
And so the big advance here is the detailed work you're doing, right?
Right. Right. Presumably.
No, and I don't know if there are lots of such studies, but I suspect it requires too much work for most people to do them.
Yeah. Yeah.
People tend, at least the ones I've seen on collaboration, tend to be survey instruments, very little interviews, something like that. So this is a very distinctive kind of organizational study.
Yeah.
And that was precisely what I was trying to do, is if you take a contract, then you can talk away collaboration, because it's a contract and it's formal, and you don't have to say what is a collaboration. You don't have to deal with any of that discourse, because you just have a contract, and who cares if it's collaboration or not. You can then just look at it. So I decided I would try to look at this a little bit more broadly with a case to see the depth and get at some of these questions. But with this particular issue, what I was trying to look at is what are the benefits and what are the costs of these relationships, however we want to define this collaboration. But I'm focusing on this one particular tie with this one organization. Let me run through a few more just to get to that. This is some of the narrative evidence. So this is a range of different people that I spoke with that just gave their view of what the Conservancy was doing. And then to give you some visuals, this is an example of the marketing that they have been able to do. If you think back to the map and the fact that these were not contiguous places, this is an effort to bring those together. The Golden Gate National Parks is a rebranding. And then all of these different places are units of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So they have succeeded in creating, or at least improved on the view of what is the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It's now called unofficially the Golden Gate National Parks, and there's all kinds of signage to try to create a cohesive place. With their fundraising, they also have the same motif, but they do a very good job of drawing in individuals and using marketing in a way that public agencies historically have not done, right? This was for a major campaign, a $35 million campaign to change the public area called CRISSY Field. And this is something that was done by the nonprofit that had a member of the board that was at an advertising agency, and they did it not necessarily pro bono, but certainly at a reduced cost. This is some of what the park partners can do, in my opinion, for the national park. Then if you look more directly at the capital campaigns and what they did. CRISSY Field, as you mentioned, this whole area used to be part of the military. CRISSY Field was the backyard of the Presidio, and it was essentially a dump site for quite a long time. It had a military airfield. It had a lot of toxics in the area. It was not utilized by the public. There was a very small strip where people would take their dogs, but it was something that was dramatically underutilized. And so the CRISSY Field campaign, the Grow CRISSY Field, was an effort to restore and reestablish that area. So what they did is they removed all of the damage, all of the tires, and have created a public place. They just celebrated the 10-year anniversary, and you see they still use that same imagery of 10 years and still growing. So it's a way now to draw people in to the park. It has increased accessibility of the park. Some would say they have increase the public value of the park through this, not simply by restoring the area, but by getting people committed to the area, not just in terms of volunteering, but in terms of donations. So they got people to commit to the national park financially. They also got people to go in and weed. They got people to go in and move trash. They got people to go in as a community and do things that hadn't been done before. So that is on one side what I think the public value is. One more picture here to give you a sense. This is a restored tidal marsh. This is where the airstrip used to be. And clearly, it's getting a great deal of public use. I have run on that area. Probably some of you have as well. This is all part of CRISSY Field. It was not usable, right? And it's national park land. So now it is. And almost all of this was done by the national park partner working with the public agency itself. So that's one side of what they do. The other side of the public value they contribute, based on my interviews and what I find, volunteering, they get a tremendous amount of people to come in and do trail maintenance, to steward the area that couldn't be done with just Park Service employees. They have a great deal of civic engagement. They have people who come to planning meetings and talk about what the park should look like. They debate the next project that should be done in this park. So they get people involved, engaged, and vocal about their national park. Yes, the public agency itself does this, but part of what the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy can do through its membership, through its board, is to duplicate, multiply, replicate those efforts. So they're able to expand the reach, the depth, and the ability of the public agency to reach diverse communities, to get new people involved and new people engaged. So a few more pictures just to show you that. But first, let me give you some of these quotes. So the goal here with these quotes is the narrative evidence is so that you're not just hearing me say this. These are people who said it to me. The evidence I'm drawing is from these interviews. What do the national park partners do? What is the benefit of the Conservancy? What are the challenges of working with the Conservancy? Trying to get a sense from talking to as many stakeholders of what they actually do, what good they do, what harm they do, what is the benefit. So hopefully by using some of these, you get the sense that this isn't just me surmising this from reading a few books. It's actually talking to a variety of stakeholders who have a lot to say about what these partnerships can achieve.
Who's actually managing the civic engagement component?
There are quite a number of different people.
Within the Park Service? I mean,
it's collaborative. It's collaborative in the sense that they work together. There are planners whose part of their job is to manage the civic engagement component of planning. It depends on how broadly you want to define civic engagement. There's a volunteer coordinator.
Planners, public planners, or are they?
Yeah, but there are planners on staff at the Conservancy as well.
Planners on one of our graduates is.
Yes, they have quite a number. So it's not, I wouldn't call it centralized. There are volunteer coordinators for those who are going to go do site stewardship. There are other forms of civic engagement that is guided, but not so much by a specific person. So this is just some examples of what they're doing. A few more here of all the different people that they're trying to bring in, diversify the place, and as a summary of what they've been able to achieve. $218 million raised, all right? I mean, that's a pretty decent amount. They grow 140,000 native plants annually. They provide environmental awareness for 18,000 children. So there's a great deal of what they've been able to do, just in terms of straightforward facts, right? With CRISSY Field itself, it was about a $35 million campaign. They were able to get a great deal of people involved on all levels. And a lot of this, the National Park Service employees themselves attribute to the work of the Conservancy. They don't obviously say this is what they did and no one else did anything, but it was a collaboration. They worked together. They were able to pull this off. So this is one side of the benefit, right? The other side to the story is what can happen if it goes awry or if it goes wrong. And I want to be clear to say that the model in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area scares a lot of people in the National Park Service. This is a threat on a lot of levels. And so many people, even in the national parks that I spoke to, where they have seen all of the benefit that comes from this, are dramatically concerned about this model gone wild, right? So one of the sides is autonomy and control. That's the classic resource dependence argument. Why would a National Park Service agency want to give over control to anyone else? And what does that imply? So there's a great deal of problem in the sense that if the partnership doesn't work out and you give the nonprofit responsibility to do something and it fails to do so, it can create negative public value. So it can actually do damage. It's not just that it didn't benefit, it's that it actually harmed. This issue of donor intent and resource dependence, which is how much is this the tail wagging the dog? How much can the National Park Service resist a $20 million donation to fix X when they don't want to do that, right? And how will they be obligated to do so as a result of these new partnerships? Yeah, David.
So just a quick question. So what role does the public agency play in selecting the head of this nonprofit, and also does any public official serve on the board of this nonprofit?
Technically, this is a nonprofit, private nonprofit, but it has a cooperative association agreement, which means that there are certain things that are perhaps not as typical. But the board is totally a normal board from anywhere else. I believe the superintendent is ex officio. I don't think he's actually legally allowed to be on the board. I think there's some stipulation that he can't be, but I'm not positive about that. In this particular case, the executive director had been a National Park Service employee, and it's the same case with the Conservancy in the Yosemite Conservancy. He had been the superintendent of several national parks before he became the executive director of this agency. So they try to keep it somewhat in the family for trust and for belief and all that stuff, but there's not a legal requirement for that to be the case as far as I understand. Because it's a 501c3, just like any other nonprofit.
Right, but similar ones I know of explicitly say they do not allow a public official to be on their board. But the ex officio kind of like splits the difference because they're usually not a voting member, but they just hover. Right. Right,
and believe me, every single Conservancy event I attended had a National Park Service employee there. Right, this is a relationship that is very close. I mean, they are in the same building. The Conservancy gets coffee for the Park Service employees from Pete's, so it's a very close relationship. So let me give you a few dangers and quotes to give you a sense of what's going on here. Yeah, Peter.
The risk that they feel that you talked about at the top is, do they tell you stories about actual cases where things went wrong, or is this just they do?
They do. Let's see if some of these clear it up. Have any of you seen this? It's because it didn't exist. I made it up. But it is what they are afraid of. This is, and this was said in some of my stories, is once you open the door, all the doors are open. It's the view of the domino effect that, sure, this nonprofit partner is good, but the next thing you know, we're going to have the Coca-Cola half dome, right? So that was one of the dangers. As far
National Rifle Association.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, now you're legally allowed now to, yeah. So let me give you a chance to read some of these, see if it gets at what Peter was talking about. So let me show you one more fake picture.
Okay.
Some would say, right? And then I'll give you a few more quotes here, but I wanted to intersperse it with something else. And this also is fake, just in case you weren't sure. So I know it's a lot of text, but it's the only way that I have of showing and demonstrating that there are plenty of different people that I spoke to that have considerable reservations. Some of the examples are visitor centers that were supposed to be created, and then the National Park Partner couldn't make it happen, and then they would go to Congress and try to lobby for funds to do that, and created a lot of embarrassment for the national park. So there are plenty of examples where it hasn't worked out the way they wanted to. Not every superintendent gets along with the executive director of the park partner, so there are a lot of petty problems that exist interorganizationally everywhere. And the question is, what does that do for us when we think about the value of these park partnerships? When you get lobbying going on, what is that? When you have a great deal of resources. This one speaker who told me this story was quite close to this and was very involved. And I think he actually captures the sentiment, which is they were able to raise a massive amount of money in a short period of time, and they were able to do this on our land with very little help. This needs to stop. And so there has been backlash. And the backlash has been standardization, regulations, weakening the power of the National Park Service partners to do precisely what they could possibly do. And so this is where that debate comes back in of what should a nonprofit partner be able to do, and what are the regulatory aspects to this that we can think about. So these are the questions that I came up with. And how do we weigh the autonomy against what they can possibly do? Because I hope I have demonstrated that they can, in fact, do a lot if given the opportunity to do so. But there are risks there involved. This notion of a superintendent gone wild is plausible. Some superintendents may have less restrictions in their mind than others in terms of what they're going to do. And there is some opportunity to do things first and ask for permission later. In fact, the superintendent of this national park has been accused of that in the past. Yeah.
But that could be independent of any partnering.
It could be, but it's easier when you have resources that aren't part of a line item that specify exactly what and how you can do it. So if you get a $5 million grant and you decide, you know what, I'm going to put up this structure right here. I mean, I don't know why they do that. But with $5 million, they might be able to go a long way to doing that before people notice. Whereas with the line item, hypothetically, that's a little harder to pull off.
David, you're talking about a balancing here, and which leads me to think about, are you able to assess how these things are moving over time, so that, are these concerns growing or diminishing? Is there some equilibrium that's been established because of the joint culture of the partnership? And another one I thought about just in this is the public agency or the nonprofit entities attracting the most talented young people? I'm thinking of over time, the hollow state argument, which is, you say you're keeping management, but you're really losing your talent to the private sector because that's all the innovation, fun, and money is, or whatever. It would be money in this case. But where's the talent going? What do young people see as the most exciting thing to do if they are committed?
Yep. One of the sources of tension in this national park is the view that the Conservancy people get to do all the fun things. The National Park Service employees are paid more. They're in fact paid more, but they are more restricted in what they can do, and there is some of that tension. And there's also a great deal of tension that the more volunteers you have, it sounds so petty, but it's very real. The more volunteers you have in the national park, the less you need national park employees. So it's the view of a replacement, and especially if it's a staff member and not a volunteer. So if you have this conservancy guy running around, well, that's taking away a potential job from a National Park Service employee. So some of these things are very real, and I don't mean to minimize them. They're that tension. I mean, that's particularly what I was trying to get at with this study, is to say, all right, let's take for granted, which I did poorly, the notion of what a collaboration is, and let's look at what the positives and negatives and what we can get out of it and what the potential trade-offs are. And this is where we start to get to with what are the downsides. Everyone loves civic engagement, but what happens when that becomes lobbying, which this national park partner does very well? Because they have a good board, they have access to Dianne Feinstein, they have access to Nancy Pelosi, they have access to Barbara Boxer, they have access that other places don't have because they don't have that kind of board, they don't have that kind of track record, but it's a nonprofit that has the power it needs to get things done. And in a world of nonprofits, that's what you should do. But in a world of partnering with National Park Service agencies, there's a great deal of concern, because it could become a balkanized system where those who have good advocates get more money, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of back and forth.
One just simple graphic that might be a useful illustration is just the budgets of the park versus the budget of this nonprofit, to try to get a sense of, is the relative contribution becoming greater over time, and therefore the concerns about, you know, whether or not they can call the shots is growing or diminishing, or because my guess would be that it's probably growing over time, just because parks budgets are getting cut and nonprofits over time tend to be able to raise more money.
Yeah, and they are extremely concerned about this, and that goes back to the initial argument of, is this privatization or is it something else? The national park, in this particular instance, has had a relatively flat budget, meaning they're not losing money. Their costs are going up, so relatively they're doing worse. The Conservancy continues to do very, very well, but part of that is donative, so it's not simply earned income. So their budget is increasing, but it's not a budget that comes from federal appropriations. It comes through its earned income, it comes through fundraising, it comes through other sources.
Do you have any sense whether this is 5% of the budget, 10%?
I think it's close to 50. I think it's close to 50. I don't know what exactly the operating budget is, but I have their most recent annual report. It'd be really easy to check. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was 17 million in revenue. Keep in mind they're giving a lot of that back to the national park. I mean, that's their reason for existence.
Right, right. No, because the closest analog I can think of, and something that I'm looking at, are these friends of library groups and friends of local education foundations. And those are usually under 5% of this budget is coming from these types of groups, and there are concerns at that level. And if you get up to 50%, then you really are talking about resource dependence. No,
what you are raising as a problem is precisely what they are concerned about. Is the Friends Group model is really simple. The Friends Group model is you raise money, you give it to the national park, and the national park does what it wants with it. This is an example of a real nonprofit. So it's a nonprofit that doesn't just raise money, it actually does stuff. It lobbies, it implements projects, it helps with planning, it helps with implementation, it gets volunteers. It acts like any nonprofit we would see anywhere else, like the American Red Cross. It's not some weak appendage that just does the bidding of the national park. And that's what is causing this tension, and what I think gives value to the study itself of thinking, what do we need and what do we get from this? I think the benefits of a good partner are unambiguous. But then if you look at what is required, you actually need a nonprofit that has high capacity and is able to do the things that scare you that it can do. Right? So that's the paradox, and how we find that balance. So I think looking at it this way gives us a broader view of what public value is, how we can think about what these partners give to the park, what they may cost the park, and where we go from there. Yeah.
A small question, and then back to your public values. The small question is, you mentioned several times that they raise money and give it to the park. Does it stay within that park, or does it go back to Washington?
No, that's a whole different issue. And that's part of what their lobbying has succeeded
here. Yeah. Whether you're enthusiastic about your partner,
No, the reason I'm hesitant is that's precisely part of the concern, is that there are some who say that the lobbying allows them to have that money be reinvested in the Goliad National Recreation Area instead of going back to the general fund. Yeah. And that's what a lot of these legislators can do. You're seeing more and more national parks begin to try to keep some resources at home, whether that be through different cost structures for parking, different types of fee services that in the past you could go to a national park and it's your money. Now they're doing some site-based. The money gets to stay with them.
Not everybody may know that the history of this is any revenue collected by a park or forest service goes back to the general treasury. It does not stay with the organization. So now we're talking about, so that's no incentive to raise money. You're never going to see it back again in your own entity. But this, that's why I'm asking you. I know there's some changes underway, and it's, I guess, how much?
Yeah.
My second thing on the public values, you started out with a set of considerations for which you weren't measuring.
Yep.
Like legitimacy increased. I mean, you want to help us about public values, but what you've shown us is their, we'll call it their outputs.
Right.
But you haven't talked about some of those other issues that you said would help us understand the increased public value.
Okay.
What the public thinks.
Yeah.
What the visitors think. In some of that link back to your notion about increasing public value. Are you going to be doing that, or where?
Well, no. I mean, what I thought I had was the process improvements and the physical park improvement. Whether that leads to greater legitimacy, I don't know if I can answer. I think I infer that it does.
Well, but you raised that for us. You said that's one of your considerations. So I'm curious how many of your own criteria can be judged by you or anybody else. In terms of doing this.
I could go back and interrogate the data again and see. Yeah, I don't know.
I wonder to what extent these, whatever the collaborative arrangement, to what extent are they kind of mandated by the original congressional enactment of the park? Since there might be a situation, it's sort of strange bedfellows kind of thing, so you have to work with a congressionally mandated foundation. Nothing much you can do. If I have a choice, I'll do it all by my own agency.
There are things that are changing that again go back to what I believe is the direction, which Dan asked about earlier. There are some cooperating associations that serve 30 parks because they're small parks, or that they just don't have the resources to create their own association. There is the National Park Foundation, which is supposed to be universal for the United States. So it's supposed to serve all parks. But you're seeing, I think it's 25% of friends groups have been created in the last 10 years. So a lot of these national parks are creating their own friends groups. A lot of national parks that are part of umbrella cooperating associations are trying to get out of those and create their own locally site-based one. So it's moving in the direction, and in addition, moving in the direction of combining the friends group and the cooperative association role. That's what Yosemite has done. That's what the Golden National Recreation Area is doing. That is not, in my view, going to diminish. And so they are trying to change the system they have now to make it more site-based and local, so that they can do precisely this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That could be the resource dependency argument. So you have this foundation that have its own logic of existence. You can't control them too much. Then why don't you form a lot of these friendly partnerships? Sure. That you can have more leverage on.
Sure.
Yeah. Got to be some more questions here.
Oh, I have one.
Please. This is my opportunity for those of you who haven't.
Well, so you're taking us through the story of the parks, and although I know not everybody's familiar with all the details, you've highlighted, I think, nicely. And so I'm thinking of this as something about parks or something about the transformations going on in society. And I think of the parallel of public school foundations and support groups, which is in our own community right now, but everywhere in the United States, where public schools feel under pressure for the inability to provide goods. They are now creating foundations, local-based, attached to schools, and or asking support groups, and or charging fees for service. And in California, it's against a lot of charge fees for services. So they are now saying the true cost of educating your child is $10,000, and we receive $5,000 from the state. Could you please help us? And they can't force the parent to pay, but there's this social pressure to tithe to the public school, to the school.
And I mean, for me, the bigger question that goes even beyond that, and I didn't want to title this talk that because I don't think it's fair, but it's this notion of a Faustian bargain. Is this something that you're getting into and not realizing the peril that comes out of it? I think the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, that partnership is unassailable in terms of how well it has managed that relationship, both the Conservancy and the public agency. So I'm very careful to not be critical. I think they've done a great job. But there are plenty of instances where that hasn't happened, and there are plenty of people who raised issues that say, what happens when? So if you create this foundation, at what point does that foundation actually say it wants something out of the relationship and is no longer simply raising money for no reason other than to give it to the school? They all of a sudden want to be a stakeholder. They want to have a say in how their money that they're raising is being used. Correct. Right. And that's precisely what I was hoping to raise here.
But analytically, this may be parallel to what's going on in schools then. So,
Very much so.
If that's the case, it's not just about parks, it's about transformation in society broader,
Yeah.
which is the analytically interesting
Yeah.
extension. And schools, people can think of several others where this is going on,
Yeah.
where services are being complemented by these kinds of partnerships.
Right. Public. It's no longer market failure, government failure. It's a very different sort of system. Yeah.
Well, so you just talked about peril, but I'm still not clear. So what I've heard, what your quotes a little while ago showed was the fear on the part of the government agency that they're going to lose autonomy and control.
Mm-hmm.
But so that's a downside from a limited perspective, but that's not necessarily a downside from a public perspective. Your slides gave a hypothetical, and sure, it might go there, but unless you've got examples of it going there, do we have simply a hypothetical fear? So I guess I'm not clear what the downside is yet.
Yeah, that's good, because maybe that'll give me more to think about. My reaction to what you just said is that the reason there hasn't been more of a downside is because the National Park Service has been so proactive in restricting what these organizations can do, almost to the point that their value is diminished and not worthwhile anymore. So they have, the best example I can think of is the Super Bowl that it was in DC, and they had some of the festivities on Capitol Mall. And some of the people I talked about were absolutely livid that the trash cans said Bud Light on them, and they had all kinds of corporate sponsorship that they did not want. They viewed that as sacrilegious. And so that was a view of, whoa, that things have gotten out of control. In the case that I studied, there was an effort, a desire to use Alcatraz in a broader way, to have music concerts there and do other sorts of things, and the National Park Service was, whoa, no. So there are plenty of instances where the attempt has been made. Yeah, exactly. So the downside may not be in what has happened. The downside may be in the fact that the National Park Service so proactively works to prevent this that they weaken any potential public value that could be created in the first place, right? So there are two ways to look at it. One is this is eventually going to happen and it hasn't yet, and maybe I'm just the harbinger of bad news. The other view is the regulatory environment is becoming so restrictive that whatever public value we may get from this is quickly going to be eroded by the regulations.
But that's not a downside of the collaboration itself. That's my, I'm not, if there's an argument that collaborations are going to cause problems, I don't know yet what those problems are, other than the agency losing autonomy and things happening that they don't want.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Maybe you're talking about the underexploit the potential of collaboration.
Yeah, the way I thought about it, and the reason I use the public value language for that is I haven't ever thought about it as the collaboration itself. I thought about damage to the national park, damage to the resources and the national heritage itself. So the idea that these partners could run wild and do something that could actually, we can come up with an example. Like they set fire accidentally to one of the historic buildings in Gettysburg because they didn't carefully follow the fire regulations that have been set up very specifically for how you're supposed to maintain a historic property. So something very simple like that, you have now destroyed public value. You have now, through that collaboration, led to something negative happening to a building that we value and no longer have. So I mean, that's an extreme hypothetical. That's the way I was thinking about the public value frame, is it isn't necessarily the collaboration itself, but these externalities, the things that you don't see by just measuring the contract. It's these long-term benefits. None of this happened in 1 year. In terms of the benefits. And the costs, presumably, although they could be catastrophic and immediate, oftentimes could be just as long-term and negative. But I don't know if that satisfies you or gets us closer, but it's useful for me to think about it. Yeah?
I mean, the other thing to note is accountability and autonomy might not be important into themselves, but there's also the question of democratic values, in that the sense that when you're moved from the bureaucracy being the signal caller to a nonprofit being the signal caller, you've broken the link between a public good being controlled by particularized interests. And so what I've read on this is the big concern is that you have nonprofits that have boards who have particular interests. And the classic case in New York is that one of the board members was on the board of a high school that used a specific park for their athletic activities. And so they made the decision that that specific park was not going to be available for public, public use because that person wanted to keep it for his high school. So you have the particularism with the nonprofit sector that while they can't extract, profits, they can. Nonprofit members, board members especially, have interests, and so they could say that we want to use this park for a more private purpose than you would expect to be possible with a bureaucracy that's controlled by a democratically elected
yeah, and just making it even simpler than what you did is this second quote, which says, it goes back to the tail wagging the dog and the notion that this park partner may direct what the public agency does and they don't want this. So it's not simply resource dependence. At that level, it's still this dyadic control, no control. If that national park partner builds something because it has the funds to do so, that the national park is reluctant to do, that could potentially be considered a diminishment, a decrease in the public value of the park. So if the national park partner is doing things that could damage, pollute, contaminate, weaken, change that park, that's the potential danger. And the reason I'm raising that is the National Park Service views itself as unambiguously not going to do this. So their view is if there's something that could happen, they just won't do it. So they are very risk averse, as the quote says, whereas the national park partner may be less risk averse. And so the view of the Platonic guardian, the view of the negative public value that can be created is where I thought there was a different hook from just the simple collaborative approach. Yeah.
Can the partners take unilateral actions, or I would have assumed everything had to be agreed upon by the park service?
Well, that depends on how much the national park partner decides to act on its own. I mean, legally, it should always go through the National Park Service, but there is autonomous action taken all the time. In the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, there are organizations that are in some of these buildings and renting, and they don't tell the Park Service everything they do. I know this, I talked to them about it. And so it is plausible that they would do something that they don't view positively. I mean, there are some very little simple things, like let's say they come in and they bring in Obama to talk, or someone that is less high profile to raise so many flags, and then they find out about it later. That can cause some concern. And those sorts of things have happened. Like they have some rally on the land, and some people say you've trampled this land. People weren't supposed to be on there. We've got an endangered species here. You see things like that all the time. So it is plausible. But for it not to happen, you have to really have a nice view of human nature, I guess.
So for the benefit of keeping to the time, so I think we have to wrap it up. I think it's excellent discussion. Thank you.
Sure, well, yeah, I'm done. So thank you very much.